Hammer all over my hand! Oh my gosh, this is so fun. There we go! Okay, good! Oh,
Keep up the good work!
I am Ryan McPherson from Mrs. Hawklow's class with your daily announcements. Today is Wednesday, December 21st, 2016. Wednesday, December 21st, Christmas class parties. Last 45 minutes of the day. Early release, 12 o'clock. Thursday, December 22nd, Monday, January 2nd, Christmas vacation, no school. Now here's your birthdays today.
Thank you, Ryan. Birthdays today. Tara Anderson, Mrs. Kinnanen. Ian Bastian, Mrs. Schneiderhan. Ellie Lassinen, Mrs. Besselow. Half birthdays today. Dominic Anderson, Mrs. Pavlich. Chase Desslier, Miss Johnson. Gavin Storos, Mr. Heltonen. Milia Storos, Mrs. Hawklaw. Birthdays over, Christmas break. Dawson Kapanen, Miss Mishka. David Escola, Mrs. Oli. Scarlett Fertro, Miss Mishka. Alexander Workman, Mrs. Darnell. Emmett Corla, Mrs. Schneiderhan. Tevin Stahl, Mrs. Darnell. Savannah Hawley, Mr. Lyon. Riley Standridge, Mrs. Oli. Cole Gervais, Mrs. Giacchino. Kyla Strom, Mrs. Kinnanen. Tristan Gray, Mrs. Stevens. Marissa Thyron, Miss Galetto. Elizabeth Crouch, Mr. Audio. Ayla Helpy, Mrs. Fenton. Jackson Brown, Mrs. Stevens. Quinn Dackwit, Mrs. Stevens. Chelsea Johnson, Mrs. Pavlich. Trent Anderson, Mrs. Bessel. Maria Lishinsky, Miss Yimker. Ellie Haru, Mrs. Besselow, Mrs. Burkhart. Half birthdays over Christmas break. Ethan Holland, Mrs. Stevens. Darian Kesty, Mrs. Schneiderhan. Linnea Peterson, Mrs. Peterson. Anders Johnson, Mrs. Peterson. Nayla Newsom, Mrs. Kinnan. Peyton Curtin, Mrs. Oli. Jada Hendrickson, Mr. Heltonen. Wyatt Walker, Mr. Heltonen. Lily Hodges, Mrs. Pavlich. Annalise Latvis, Mrs. Besselow. Gracie Capo, Mrs. Bastian. Alyssa Hoppola, Mrs. Seaver. Lincoln Hodala, Mrs. Burkhart. Violet Storm, Mrs. Schneiderhan. Sebastian Bernard, Mrs. Olson. Joanna Kangas, Mrs. Fenton. Owen Locust, Mrs. Seaver. McKenna Penglis, Mrs. Fenton. Jada Bodewine, Mrs. Johnson. Shaylin Bodewine, Mrs. Kinnan. Kavea Harris Berryman, Mrs. Peterson. Ethan or Mr. Dennis. Now here is Alex with your lunch for today.
Thank you, Chloe. Lunch for today, Little Caesars pizza, baby carrots, and cucumber slices and apple cups. Alternate yogurt, cheese stick, and whole grain roll. CLK students learn today for a better tomorrow. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance.